Hello, everyone. I'm Inga Lāce, curator from Riga, Latvia, and it is my pleasure to give a presentation, an introduction to my curatorial practice. Thanks, Teresa Jindrova and Jindřich Chalupecký Society for inviting me to take part in their visitors program. And while we're still anticipating that it can physically take place next year, I'm already very happy to give this online talk. So basically, I'm currently the CMAP Central and Eastern Europe Fellow at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And CMAP stands for Contemporary and Modern Art Perspectives, which is a cross-departmental internal research program at the Museum of Modern Art, which exists since 2009. It fosters a multi-year study of art histories outside North America and Western Europe. And I'm there facilitating research on the Baltic states, which is the focus right now. In introducing some of my recent curatorial projects, I'd like to share my screen. And yeah, and basically delve into several projects which I see important for my practice to show a little bit of diversity, introduce some artists, and introduce some methods. So in general, my practice often draws from the current social, political, environmental issues, as well as looking at the history and rethinking, reinterpreting what has happened before from the current perspective. And it refers both to historic events as well as art history. And I'm always asking myself, why is it that it is important to revisit this event or this or that artist right now? Are we also tackling an important issue of today through this process? As in the current political climate, with societal divisions, conservative and populist right-wing political movements gaining more and more traction, it is especially important to keep the space for openness, for discussion, for experiment, and to envision more equal, feminist, queer, and ecologically sustainable futures. And I believe that curatorial process, as well as space it provides, in collaboration with institutions, can actually do that. So I mentioned collaborations and giving space and voice, and especially, of course, to artists, but also to complicated issues that they raise, to marginalized groups of society, to silenced voices. I feel like that is something that is important for me. And what you see now already in the background is a project called Unexpected Encounters, taking place in 2019 and also starting in 2020 at the exhibition hall Arsenals in Riga. But it was organized by the Latvian Center for Contemporary Art, where I've been a curator since 2012. And this project we organized together with Solvita Kresse and Andri Silpetere. And in a way, this specific exhibition was related to science fiction. And so to me, it is interesting how entering 2020 with different sort of dystopian predictions, but utopian aspirations, it was somehow also a little bit of a warning of like what kind of catastrophe could await us, and which we actually experienced. Anyways, the exhibition started from the more historic engagement with graphic artists in the Soviet Latvia who were organizing exhibitions called Science and Science Fiction in the Soviet times. So, which is how we often work, like revisiting something historical, as I mentioned, and thinking like how it reverberates into nowadays, or the other way around. Like when, like with this project, it's almost like difficult to say whether we were seeing more and more artists that we are in dialogue who are actually working around those questions of imagining different futures. And then we were interested in looking like, hey, but, you know, have we seen that kind of, you know, progressive, but both also like warning, you know, elements in the art practices before? And that's how we kind of like came up to this, you know, idea to unite this moment in the 70s with Soviet Latvian artists, you know, commenting on science and science fiction, and also with that kind of exercising certain like abstract art possibilities, and of course within the allowed, you know, within what was allowed in terms of, you know, ideological constraints. And then, yeah, through younger generation artists, both Latvian and international, we would also see of what kind of, you know, future or examining the past, futures from the past, like what are, you know, they talking about. So in this image, you can see that there is, in the very end, there is a work by Pakwe Hardware, which is a Lithuanian artist duo that comments in a way on different kind of, you know, immortality. Let's say not immortality, but different kind of technologies that are enhancing, you know, your life expectancy. And at the same time, in the very front, you see, you know, an artist from the 70s who was, you know, in this work, she was, you know, the earth is basically crying, and she was worried about the ecological crisis. But at the same time, in those like hanging works, she's definitely, you know, imagining different planets. Like that's, you know, how her work was called. It was always, you know, names of planets, and it was very space related. And another work among like very many works, I'll just go through, you know, several. It's a work by Latvian artist Ieva Balode called Commission. And what she's doing basically, so this is an installation view, and there is a video where myself and the other two curators are participating. And she's touching upon this idea of rewriting a history from the women's perspective. So she's using the medium of film and different cliches that you have in the traditional kind of B-class movies, where there is a hero, usually male, you know, saving the world from, you know, from a catastrophe. And here she is, first of all, yeah, like all the characters are female, and the setting is this Soviet kind of brutalist modernist buildings. Whereas, you know, a lot of those, you know, Soviet time relationship to gender was also not so easy. You know, women had to be not only like active at work, but also had to, you know, tend to the house. And so all those like complicated relationships are there, but at the same time, she's suggesting for some sort of more like feminist, more equal future. And which is what is interesting in the younger generation of Latvian artists. I see that, and I would like to like really emphasize that themes like looking at the women's histories, exploring and openly talking about feminism is becoming more and more present. Whereas in the 90s and 2000s, even though women would sometimes do explicitly feminist work, it would be somehow still this reluctant feminism. When they, in terms of talking about it, it would be seen as, you know, something important from the West. Another work in this exhibition, I would say it was a key work, was a trilogy by Anton Vidokle, From Immortality. It's called Immortality for All, a trilogy on Russian Cosmism. And what is interesting is that we actually found a link, you can see it here, by a Latvian artist. You know, he had already, you know, had a reference to one of the main cosmists, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, whom you see in the middle, in the center of this painting, you know, surrounded by people like Copernicus, also astronauts, and such. So cosmism, it was the 19th century and late 19th century, mid 19th century and 20th century sort of movement, uniting ideas, you know, religious, scientific, you know, which were all united towards one goal, philosophical, of course. And this one goal was how to extend human lifespan, like how to reach towards immortality. And I think it's interesting in relation to also the work that I mentioned before by Pakoi Hardware, where they're commenting on you know, 21st century, like actual procedures that are happening and that are, you know, working on those same issues in a much more tech-savvy ways than perhaps, you know, people in the 19th century and beginning of 20th century were imagining. However, they were also doing different kind of experiments. And so while Anton Vidokle's trilogy is kind of looking at the traces also in nowadays, you know, like landscapes and processes of the Russian cosmism, I was particularly happy to find a painting in the Latvian National Art Museum collection where one of those cosmists was actually a centerpiece. So for us, I guess, this dialogue and maybe imaginary thinking communities where it's not about necessarily someone actually being inspired by someone else's work very directly, but at the same time, you can place them in a dialogue, and because you see that there is this relation. And I think that's something, you know, where what an exhibition can do. Another thing, and an important project which has like shaped my practice and I guess shaped also the Latvian art scene, is the Contemporary Art Festival Survival Kit. And the festival has like more than 10 years now, since it was established in 2009 as a reaction to economic crisis. So it came when the situation in the city was dire, there were very many empty shops, financing was cut for the arts, and Solvita Krese, director of the Center of Contemporary Art at the time, and still, together with a group of artists and curators, like decided to do this festival. And from this kind of very quick reaction, a lot of do-it-yourself practices, it has grown in recent years. Like it still has this very political dimension of having, you know, politically important themes, but it is more, I would say, contained in one place. It still has a lot of, you know, collaborations, public programs, but the centerpiece is an exhibition, essentially an international, you know, art exhibition. And every year the location changes, so it is either an empty building or you know, a building kind of in between. Like in this image, we see the work by Cassius Fedlabi, who is an artist from Oslo, but, you know, living in Oslo, but coming from Sudan. And he and the place where the exhibition took place was the Riga Circus. And Riga Circus at the time was going through a very interesting period. So it is in reconstruction, and that was this moment in between the old circus and the new still to become, because they had finally decided that, okay, like what is the contemporary circus? Like what is the circus that finally don't use animals, because it was doing it till a very like recent time. And I think that was a beautiful moment when to actually, do this contemporary art exhibition at the time. And the work by Cassius, in relation to both the theme, which was sort of connection between peripheries, avoiding the center, and it was called the Outlands, and somehow also to the circus, he placed Laika in the center of the piece, and there are two Ethiopian angels protecting her. And the painting style, which is particular, was also somehow proposing these different art histories, not only like the Western, where the progression would go, that you learn and you enter, like the perspective, how to do this very like realistic depiction, and then you kind of go and destroy it. Instead of that, he would refer his painting style to painting that is used in a very common, on a hair shop, for instance, in Ethiopia. You would go, you would see a haircut, and you would get a haircut, and who could say that it's not a realistic painting, even though it looks flat from the Western point of view. Then another work which I would like to talk about in relation to survival kit and issues that it addresses, it's from a different year. It's a work by Diana Tamana called Flower Smuggler, and so you see pictures of flowers from the family album here, and here is like a notice for Diana's grandmother, who actually illegally crossed the border between Latvia and Russia because her relative is still sort of buried in the Russian territory, because there has been, disputed territory in Abrane between Latvia and Russia. And, once we regained kind of independence in the 90s, that territory was left to Russia. So it is interesting how, like Diana works a lot with her family and her personal stories, and here, for instance, you see how grand changes, grand geopolitical changes, and they happen not only, when the Soviet Union was, broken, or this, or when it was sort of, or when the occupation happened, or or process of colonization and decolonization. There are always like borders created, which not necessarily are the same borders, or are, kind of are connected to the daily like ways or paths of people, right? So now to go to that territory to like visit the grave of the relative, you would have to have a visa. But of course, to just put a flower pot, the grandmother didn't have it. So she gets, actually a fine. And this is like this whole kind of fine that you see here, and description of her crime with the flower pots. And here, basically, Diana put it together with the fact that actually the grandmother likes flowers, and she is photographing her flowers, and her whole album is like full of those flowers. Yeah, so another project that very much touches upon issues, I guess, where we're trying to talk from a very personal, through very personal stories about much grander events, is another exhibition that I have co-curated with my colleagues. And it's more like an exhibition and research project called Portable Landscapes. And there we worked with this historical moment, mostly after the Second World War, when a lot of Latvian, and I would say also Baltic refugees left, you know, especially when the Soviet army was coming for the second time to invade the territory, and many artists among them. And we wanted to connect that moment and do this historic research on those artists in different places, and we choose several of those, and I will talk about several. We wanted to compare it with the very current situation, because when we started the project, it was around 2015-16, when the European refugee crisis was very much on the rise, and we felt a very grave need to talk about it in this comparison, because this hostility towards migration, migrants from Syria, from Middle East, from very troubled places was quite high, and we wanted to make this comparison also, you know, to say that, well, history is very different, and we should also have certain kind of empathy if we think about ourselves. Anyway, like the title of the project comes from an artist I know, Halek, who is an Estonian artist, and since the 70s, he's been making those pieces that are called portable sunsets. And indeed, you see the handles, so indeed they are portable. And it's a very poetic reference, I feel, because when he would talk about his piece, he would say, well, so what is that thing? What is that only thing you can take from home if you need to like flee literally from Latvia or Estonia with a boat to Sweden, to Gotland, which is the closest place? Like, obviously, this is a sunset. Basically, it's like a memory. So in this exhibition, we also showed documentary photography with the Baltic refugees in Gotland in the 40s. So to say, like, well, you know, they also were living their lives because they were spending quite a lot of time in those camps. And then we also had a work by Kristina Norman there called Common Ground. She's an Estonian artist. And again, I'm saying these histories, Estonia and Latvia, they very much mirror, you know, each other. So in the one image, you see an older woman, and she's in a house for older people in Sweden. She was a refugee from the Baltic countries, but now at her older age, she's in a very nice care home, and she remembers the horror, but, you know, she's quite at ease with like her life right now. And in the picture below, you see these newly arrived migrants from refugees from Syria who are in the middle of nowhere in Estonia without any good facilities and without possibility to meet a lot of people. And they are, you know, afraid, they're a bit, you know, insecure. And it's interesting that Kristina is saying that there is a possible common ground between those two groups. However, they will most likely never meet. And I think what is important is for our society to see this common ground, but that is another kind of challenge, which also rarely like happens. Then there is another sort of, so I spoke a little bit about the pathway of Latvian refugees to Sweden, and then there is Paris. And that's a story which we chose in Paris, which is very much different from the fleeing refugees. It's more about a woman in 1911, a Latvian woman who decides to go to Paris on her own kind of will, to pursue her idea to become a dancer. And that's Aya Bertrand. You can see her in the white dress. And she joins a commune run by Raymond Duncan. And Raymond Duncan is a brother of Isidore Duncan, the famous dancer. He's very eccentric. And somehow all this community academia in Paris that existed from the 1910s to 1970s, mostly run by her, like, you know, the practical running, you know, since they met, she was actually taking care of it. And also it was a lot of collective work. Like you see, you know, this is like dances, and they were collectively sort of managed and organized and planned. And these are the fabrics in the workshops that they were doing. These are the dresses. These are the books that they were produced. And somehow, in this display and presentation, it was kind of important that she was a Latvian woman, you know, because we were tracing these Latvian migratory ties. But it was also very important to say that she was, first of all, a woman that always like stays kind of behind in recalling about different kind of communities or different kind of like, you know, working processes. And also she was part of the collective, and actually it was the collective. So how do you in general tell a story about a collective without, you know, only talking about its eccentric leader? Yeah, so that was this kind of like interesting challenge and a way for us to, yeah, to work. And so as in each of those so-called chapters, we were really showing this historical material that we found. It was sort of a new research. And we also were inviting and putting in dialogue the contemporary artists. For example, Andrejs Strokins is a contemporary Latvian artist, and he created collages somehow which comment on this process of, so if, you know, this Latvian dancer Aye Bertrand would be living in this commune in Paris at the time, and they would, even though it was a super modern metropolis, they were, you know, like doing crafts and doing dancing practices. Then he kind of mirrored that, which seems somehow formally very similar in the first glance, but actually those are practices like done by Soviet, like children, the gymnastics, also some kind of like folkloric, you know, traditional objects made and all these things. So in a way, it's very important and interesting to bring in artists who actually can expand our view and somehow make us, you know, make those comparisons and think about, yeah, like this is a beautiful somehow thing to think about, like Cold War and this division that basically there were these two parallel worlds, and Latvia and the Baltics, they were quite isolated at the time, and you know. And another artist from, you know, that Montreal sort of story, and it's like another chapter. We have Janis Veldheims, and he was interpreted by, or he was in dialogue with Marcus Lachin. So Janis Veldheims is this historic personality, and he would do those drawings. But he was trained as a lawyer, and during the Second World War, he left Latvia. He never practiced as a lawyer, but he was extremely disappointed with the Soviet Union being created and that the Western countries didn't do anything in order to help, for instance, the Baltic countries where he couldn't go back because obviously they were occupied. And so to understand the situation, he started to read a lot of Western, you know, literature, philosophy, and started to make like small notes on the books. And then these notes became sketches, and these sketches became drawings. And he realized that instead of like writing a moralistic essay about the wrongs of the world, he basically has to, he has to counter that visually. And that is very beautiful. He is writing. I've also read his diaries. Like he is writing that soon people will understand that, you know, that to illustrate the theories, like you need to like do it with drawing. You need to do it visually. You know, you can't do it with words. And I'm thinking a lot about it because, of course, like the words are dividing. You know, they're creating new and new divisions. The more inclusive we try to be, but at the same time, I mean, we have to try, but like his idea of like, let's do it beyond words is very beautiful. And then we invited Marcus Lachins, who worked with, he created an environment, like a three-dimensional, let's say, drawing of Janis Veldheims, a labyrinth, basically. But also he worked with a group of visually impaired children. then asking like, but can we go beyond like the visual, like what would that mean? And here's like a small video of how it looks in the labyrinth. Like, so you basically are drawing in a way.
Желтый, фиолетовый. Красный, зеленый.
Zils, oranžs, sarkans, zaļš.
Yeah, and then the two, let's say, last examples, which maybe, somehow draw into very much my current interests, are, so this is a project Shared History at the Art Museum Riga Burs, which were basically interventions in the collection of Riga Burs. And Riga Burs is one part of the Latvian National Art Museums, and it holds a collection of Western European Romanticist art and artifacts from the East. And it comes from the different collections of different aristocrats, different Baltic Germans that lived in Latvia in the 17th, 18th, 19th century. And here is particularly interesting, I think, portrait. So first of all, painting by Radan Saleh from the 19th century, and then portrait of Radan Saleh himself by a Baltic German artist. And this is how I started to get interested in this collection. So I would see those paintings nearby each other in this museum, and it would draw my interest because basically, why do we have, among many Western artists, you know, who did very similar paintings, why do we have this artist who is considered to be like Southeast Asian modern painter? You know, he comes from Indonesia. He would be one of the first ones, you know, who learned this Western painting because he came from the colony to the Netherlands. He was taught there. Then he went to Germany. Then there he probably had relationships with those Baltic Germans. And that's how the paintings ended up in Latvia. But like that story, to me, it seemed that through that museum and through that story, you can actually talk about, you know, it can be a window of so many different topics, because somehow we often think like, how do we relate and how do we talk and teach, you know, our, you know, ourselves about colonialism, like where, and I think like that sometimes there are these material objects that hold those stories, and museum can really be a place where to look at those. And then to me, and the title is a shared history. So for me, this term shared history seemed to be very sort of productive in imagining that through this one painting, you can see that there is a certain shared history. There is this one moment of connection, and through there we can kind of further expand it. And I think if you look at the collections, especially in more like we know very well what collections of the Netherlands mean, like what are the colonial collections, you know, in the Tropen Museum and places like that. But when you look at the more marginal places, I mean, and I'm using this term like really because of a lack of a better one, you can see, I think, much more complex and layered relationships that unfold. And sometimes these are relationships between the two peripheries. And so that made me start this project and research, which, I mean, the exhibition already happened, but I'm still very interested. And especially, so there's these two paintings, but I also invited artists to work with the collection and so they were doing interventions. But what was interesting for me specifically, and you see it here, where there's this pamphlet of like Congo rhythms in Riga Castle, that I was looking. So, you know, that was 19th century. then we have a leap, and I was looking at what was happening in this museum in the Soviet times, and somehow this museum was also that museum where there were many exhibitions taking place of art from India, from Congo, which were so-called, you know, cultural diplomacy exhibitions. So like if in Moscow there was a happening, you know, like of an Indian festival, you know, because it was a friendship between India and Russia and Soviet Union, then in Latvia you wouldn't have maybe the whole program, but you would have this exhibition of Indian art. And I felt that for many people in the museum, it still seemed like, well, we were really looking forward to exhibitions of art from Belgium or something, but then we also had to do this exhibition from Congo and or from, you know, India. And it, for me, is still an open research, because I'm actually very interested in those exhibition histories, how to look at them beyond just deeming them cultural diplomacy and friendship exhibitions. Of course, they have a political meaning, but also I think, and which I discovered, there are certain, you know, works that came from collections, and you would have certain, you know, now considered modern, like Indian artists, and so I think that in terms of looking at these shared histories, like this is still an array, you know, of research. Yeah, and maybe to end up, I'll finish with the fact that, well, currently, and I'm interested in environmental questions, so it started actually at the Apple Art Center, where I was a fellow in 2016. And then in 2019, a publication came out called Instituting Ecologies. And at that time, I was looking at the relationship between, you know, art institutions, art and ecology, and thinking like, what can happen? Like, what are people practicing that is perhaps, you know, oftentimes representational, you know, of ecological crisis, of catastrophe, but what are actually the policies of institutions themselves that they could call themselves sustainable, you know, within their operation? Like, what would that mean? Like, what is this sustainability in terms of environment, in terms of like mental and social relationships, in terms of payment, you know, many things. And also what would, and do we have a certain kind of agency in a larger climate discussions? So there were several symposia, and then this publication came out. And I think from there, I also continued like that line, which, because we met at the Apple Art Center, brought me in dialogue with curator Jussi Koitala. And we have this ongoing project called Performing the Fringe. And I think this is really beautiful how these conversations end up into projects. So we started, you know, discussing already in 2016 at the Apple. Then like 3 years later, we finally were doing it. And basically Performing the Fringe is this project, as you see, with us hanging out with the artists. So it's like the methodology of having artists and curators together to engage in walks as a curatorial and artistic process, so that, you know, we have a certain framework, which we were doing. You know, we were in Pori, in Finland, in Stockholm, and in Vilnius. And we were looking at the fringe of the city, between like the city and the non-city, the city and the forest, the city and the countryside, as a potentiality for new economic relationships, for new relationships between human and non-human. But at the same time, we were also looking at certain kind of common embodied research process and just being together. So I think as a methodology, it was something that was, of course, possible in 2019 and wouldn't have been possible perhaps this year. Yeah, but this is what we did, and now we still have an exhibition to do in the Pori Art Museum. Yeah, so thank you for this, for listening. And yeah, to say that, of course, one process reaches or starts the other. And when, coming back from Amsterdam, I'm already several years based here and also working at MoMA as a research fellow for the Baltic countries. I'm specifically interested in, the questions that interest me maybe in a wider sense, their origination or their origin in Latvia. So one of the things that I'm looking at are the, ideas of eco-nationalism and how in the end of the 80s, the processes that actually sparked the national sort of, awakening were actually started by environmental movements, because they were possible. In the Soviet times, it was possible to kind of protect nature and protest and go into movements. And actually, and because there were many infrastructural projects which were really damaging for the nature. And because it was maybe more eco-nationalism than actually like ecological concerns, perhaps that's why, those projects ended up, or those groups ended up dissolving or becoming very marginal with their ecological concerns, but actually like sliding into more nationalism once the independence was actually restored. So and that is something also interesting in terms of like how actually Latvia and the Baltic countries are defining themselves. And we are looking, at this idea of a nature's nation, of like how, it has been since, the 19th century, connected to Baltic, emerging new countries. We would be connecting ourselves with our land and with our nature, and how it does not necessarily mean any sort of more progressive environmental policies. And so it's interesting to find colleagues in the Baltics that are doing very similar research. For instance, Linda Kaljundy in Tallinn. And I'm looking forward sort of to actually enhance those links between the Baltics and look at those issues as more common, as like transporter, regional, instead of simply, local and national. So how to, within research and within work, like in the future, to extend those boundaries. And then, from one region, it's also interesting to go to another, and sort of like that would be also my, interest in Prague and in Czech Republic, and as well, with also could be also, to do this sort of comparative work, parallel work, collaborations in the future, that are productive, and that not necessarily have to go through the usual pathways, and this is maybe where, voila. So thank you very much.